Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. We are excited to offer 2 starting levels of professional trainings designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is a psychoeducational training designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. The Level 2 NARM Therapist training is a comprehensive clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, as well as current mental health graduate students and clinical interns and trainees. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. Monti Paul received her Master of Education in Educational Counseling from the University of Texas at Austin. Monti has worked in clinical settings, in community mental health, in a psychiatric hospital, and now in private practice. Monti specializes in working with people who have experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, and trauma. Most recently, she has integrated the neuroaffective relational model principles and insights into working with psychedelic and plant medicines. Monti Paul and Brad Kammer will present a webinar titled Healing Complex Trauma with Psychedelics and Plant Medicine, which airs live on May 4th, 2023, and which can be purchased later if you can't attend live. The details and forthcoming recording can be found at www.narmtraining.com. Please enjoy my conversation with Monti Paul. Monti Paul, thank you so much for joining us here on Transforming Trauma.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we start out these conversations with the question that you might be familiar with as we start NARM sessions with, and that is, what would you like listeners to get out of our conversation today?
I'd like them to have an idea of how NARM really can support this burgeoning field around psychedelics and plant medicine, and how important it is to have training in complex trauma when you're working with such things, how delicate and important these medicines are, and how important it is to have really good training and support around it.
I am really excited about this conversation I was mentioning to you before we pushed record. And part of that is that we have a webinar with you coming up. I'm so excited. It's going to be soon. I'm not sure how many weeks from the point that this episode airs, but the name of the webinar is Healing Complex Trauma with Psychedelics and Plant Medicine. So can we start there? Tell us about the work that you're doing in the field of complex trauma and how that relates to psychedelics and plant medicine.
So right now, I am in private practice, seeing clients, utilizing NARM mostly. Obviously, we all have clients that we're just supporting through things. And since we don't have FDA approval yet for a lot of the psychedelic medicines, this is something I will show a slide at the webinar about. The big ones that everybody knows about that are coming through the pipeline are psilocybin, which is mushrooms, and MDMA. Last we heard from the MAPS founder, Rick Doblin, those should be coming through with FDA approval, hopefully late 2023 to sometime in 2024. Right now, you have off-label use of ketamine. There is a labeled use nasal spray, and ketamine can be used in different ways. There's an oral tablet, there is an intramuscular injection, and there's IV. So there's different routes of administration. And right now I am supporting clients with pre-sessions, so setting their intentions, checking in with them, assessing where they are, and then within about 24 to 48 hours, ideally, we do an integration session post-ketamine. I have sat in on intramuscular sessions with clients as well. That can be a little bit harder with just kind of logistics is really why.
Yeah, coordinating.
Yeah, but otherwise I would love to be able to do more of that. It's just coordinating logistics. But I do find it very fulfilling to be able to help people find what their intention is, as we do in NARM. You know, what is your heart's desire, right? What is it that you want for yourself? So I find that NARM is a perfect match because you really are honoring this inner sense and really asking the client to find what they want for themselves. And then you talk that through along with some other pieces of like what this experience might be like, which also the prescriber has gone over. We work very closely with our prescribers. I cannot prescribe medicine. So I do collaborate very closely with a few prescribers here in town, in Austin, that is. And then we work through afterwards, what was your experience like? How did that relate to this intention? And asking questions around what came up for you, what was that experience like, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what I'm doing right now. And that's a long answer. And what I'm waiting for. Some people are still doing things like ayahuasca retreats and things like that. I have left that to, shamans. I have helped people who've done this, who've gone on their own, because I'm not suggesting that anybody do anything illegal. And I have helped people integrate afterwards that experience, like what's come up, what did you notice? And then I've had clients try some other things on their own as well. So right now, with the legality issues, it's really supporting that integration and that setting the intentions.
Okay, wonderful. And you mentioned how important it is for clinicians to have a strong foundational understanding of complex trauma. Can you share with us how you would define complex trauma? Like, what are you seeing and how are you holding that?
Well, I would use kind of any of the NARM definitions that we utilize, looking at the survival strategies, attachment, relational, developmental, right? So there's implicit and explicit experiences that people have. There's default emotions. There's the child consciousness. But one of the things that I've been very, very curious about and that I've talked to many people about is looking at the survival strategies without objectifying people, of course, but being cognizant. Let me give you a little definition. There's two definitions to the medicines, plant and psychedelics, because MDMA is technically not a plant medicine. It's synthetic. So MDMA tends to fall into a category called empathogens, which is more connecting, empath, right? And then you have things like psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, which is implicated in the bufo, with the frogs. Those are considered more entheogens, and that means the God within. So when you're experiencing entheogen, you're often facing yourself and facing kind of what some people call the darker side of yourself. So you see all aspects of yourself. So you can take that concept however you want. But if somebody has had a lot of early infancy trauma, so they're disconnected from themselves, they're very analytical or even very spiritual, but not really embodied, the experience of having to face all of that can lead to problems. And I've talked with other people about this who aren't NARM practitioners about, you can feel like with ketamine, for instance, you can feel like disassociated, but also connected simultaneously. And so there could be the possibility, and there have been people talking about a psychotic break or fragmenting of the self. And so that's something that I think is really, really important that complex trauma, and specifically NARM, looks at, is how much are you actually able to connect with yourself, and how much are you kind of disconnected from that perspective. So if you're very rooted there, I think it's an important issue. So that's something that I'm really looking at, because I believe, and this is my hypothesis, right? I have no way to test it, but this is what I believe, my informed hypothesis, that people who are experiencing that need a lot more support and therapy around things like using NARM to kind of work on those issues before they go in full force. And psychedelics and plant medicine are wonderful, but as the folks at Polaris have said, and other people have said, this is not going to work for a third of people, just like everything else. And so making it the magical cure is not okay, and it still requires work. There is some thought that the plant medicines can help on their own. There's a lot of discussion. I like to say it's still the wild, wild west. There's a couple of groups out there. Obviously, since I did some trainings with Polaris Insight Center, I'm in their listserv or Google group. And then there's a big tent ketamine. And so there are constant discussions and emails and research every day, multiple ones to read through, to kind of keep abreast of what's going on and figure out where we stand. There's also different things happening in different states, because ketamine is technically off-label usage for this, unless it's the nasal spray, the S-ketamine nasal spray specifically. So the DEA is talking about, well, do we need to have in-person sessions? How many in-person sessions do they have to have with the prescriber? So there's all this stuff that's happening. And, also what health conditions are contraindicated. Right now, we don't want people who have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia utilizing these, right? So there's just a lot going on. But so understanding from a systems framework, what's going on, which I think NARM so holds, and that's one of the things I find so valuable, one of the many things, let me say. And so really being able to hold what complex trauma is. And so giving you a definition is like, attachment, relational, developmental, NARM. So all the things, it's really holding and I think embodying as the clinician, because one of the things that is talked about, that NARM talks about that I love, is countertransference. It was a big topic in training because what you're holding when people are in that state, they are vulnerable. There's another podcast that talks about something that happened with some people who were dealt with some serious issues and violations around psychedelic medicines that I think I did put a piece in the webinar about. But the Cover Story podcast from the New York Times, I think it was New York Times, talked about this whole psychedelic medicine issue of violations happening. And sadly, there have been some situations that we all know about, not only people taking advantage and pressuring people where people feel like they didn't have consent, but also sexual abuse. So there is that out there. So being able to really walk people through consent and holding that they may feel like they want to make us happy during the session, even in this altered state, holding that they're vulnerable, acknowledging that, and really going over in those pre-sessions that agency and consent, really hammering that home, informing that consent, because touch is a big thing that comes up. How do you feel? What kind of touch is comfortable for you? And then the clinician checking in. What kind of touch is comfortable for me? I may be only okay with putting my hand on your hand. I don't know that I want to be involved in anything else, And then, keeping in mind our own experiences of that, knowing that they're vulnerable, knowing how we feel when people are vulnerable, knowing what may come up and being able to face that. So being really in our bodies and embodied in the whole self and doing the work for ourselves is key, because you cannot show up if you don't recognize what's happening for you and what's happening for the client. So the countertransference is huge.
Yeah. And you're really naming this piece of how vital, of course, always the ethics are around how we're doing our work, and how someone who has experienced complex trauma has often had boundaries crossed, and how it could get so messy if we're not really clear on what we're working with and how we can show up in a really ethical way.
I think that's one of the biggest things for me. The most important probably is the ethics of this, because we're trying to help people heal, and they're vulnerable and extra vulnerable, and everybody's on the bandwagon and everybody wants to do this, and oh my God, it's magical. And it's like, no, let's slow down and really see if this is the right fit for you. Obviously, I don't get to fully decide that, but I do have informed opinions based on, my education. And then with the prescriber, of course, because the prescriber gets to prescribe it. So there's a consultation, and then of course the client gets input. Really slowing it down, really acknowledging and honoring what we talk about. There's a lot of talk about sacredness in plant medicine, so that's psychedelics. And I think the sacredness of someone showing up, being willing to show up in that way with that vulnerability, even if it may be a strategy, they're still showing up. And so we have to really honor that human in front of us that's showing up with all that vulnerability, all that courage, in my opinion. And so the ethics are one of the reasons I wanted to do this webinar. I really want people to understand how important it is to have training and knowledge, and then also consultation. You need to be consulting, you need to be asking questions of yourself and checking in with others. I don't just talk to people who are trained in, this plant medicine, psychedelic medicine. I'm talking to my NARM community constantly about this and firing off, like, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? I had this thought, because if I don't ask those questions, how can I help support people? As you can see, I'm very passionate about that.
You're on fire.
Yes.
I love it. You've kind of shared with us a little bit of how you're holding complex trauma and this ethical piece that is so vital. What led you to do this work? I mean, what drew you here?
You know, it is a really funny answer because back in the 90s when I was in high school, I went to Performing Visual Arts High School. So we were playing with some of these things as teenagers and then in my early 20s. And, being just kind of closer to that artistic world, I think you learn about it too. Like I knew about, the Beatles doing their thing and all these other stories that I don't know if other kids knew about as much in the 90s. So that was part of it. And then I actually have a friend here who is a nurse practitioner, and she just started telling me, she's like, oh my God, have you heard about this? Have you heard about that? We had worked together for a few years closely. Just again, collaborative care is the best care. So we always made sure to talk about what's going on with this person. And, she'd offer insights, I'd offer insights. And so she told me, hey, there's a conference. It was November 2019 on psychedelics. Do you want to go? And I was like, yeah, that sounds really cool. This sounds really neat. I started to read up on it. I was like, wow, that makes sense. And I had heard in other programs from other people, oh, they're using MDMA for this. I was like, really? That's really interesting. So then I got a real serious education over the course of 2 days. And I think the most powerful thing to me, there were so many different things, but what really, really moved me is the MDMA with veterans. So you have the PTSD that is rooted, I think, in complex trauma that you see in combat vets, because I've had clients who have this experience, is some of the worst I've ever seen. And I started out my work at what is now called SAFE here. It was called Safe Place. It's the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Center. So I saw a lot of PTSD. That's my first foray into therapy. That's where I learned, and so it's near and dear to my heart. And just to watch, there were 2 men and one of them their wives, to watch them give their testimony of how much things had changed. I mean, these men would have probably ended their lives sooner or later. And it just blew me away. It just blew me away how much this changed for them, because I've seen and heard through the years how much people are trying to do with the VA, trying to do this, trying to do that. This was life-changing. I mean, they had tried everything. And so that really impacted me deeply, to see people who a lot of people have given up on. I mean, the VA will even, I've heard things said like, oh, well, you just don't want to get better. Lovely. Or you have to do exposure therapy, otherwise you can't see the psychologist once a week. You can only see the psychologist once a month. And I know they're strapped. Like, I'm not saying that it's, but there's just these messages institutionally. And I think it's hard. You're dealing with some real serious issues with that. So that really moved me and got me. I mean, and then there was Dr. Hart, I think, from Columbia University, neuroscience professor, Carl Hart, talking about, he was just really moving. He was talking about why, drugs aren't the problem. And this is right before I started training in NARM. He said, it's trauma. He said, you can do drugs. And he's on record saying he does heroin occasionally. But he's not addicted because the underlying issues he's dealt with, which was fascinating to me. And so, there was all these pieces that I was going, whoa, are you kidding me? So seeing all these people who'd been doing the work, the research, and the impact really made a difference. And then, so I did that. And then I did a NARM training in January 2020. And I was just like, whoa, my mind was blown. And I was sold and applied for the CIIS program. And here I am today.
And here you are. And here we're talking. What brought you to NARM, though? So you did this training in November of 2019, right before everything changed in the world. You started the NARM training, sounds like, right before everything started really changing.
Yes, we got to meet in person, our cohort, just once, which was really, really lovely.
Just once.
Yeah, but that was so lovely. I mean, that one time really made a huge difference and impact. I had colleagues talk to me about NARM, and there's one colleague who kept mentioning it, and she kept saying, it's life-changing, it's life-changing. And I was like, all right, you know what? I'm going to do it. It's complex trauma. Like, I'm just going to, I read up very little, not a lot, just like, oh. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do this. I need a complex trauma training, given my background, given that I'm curious about this psychedelic medicine. I see clients who I've worked with, childhood sexual abuse and all these other issues, and yet, these other modalities don't get to the root. I see people who are just still struggling, or people who, what we see with ketamine, why it's often prescribed, treatment-resistant depression. Well, to me, treatment-resistant depression is just complex trauma. I mean, that's just how I see it. And so I'm like, seeing this, going, okay, let's give this a shot. A friend of mine I also told about, Dee Dee Sigmund Johnson. And so she joined too. So that was really special, actually. And so we just dove in. And buy-in was not hard because it was just a really great experience and so honoring from the beginning as a trainee. So it's all kind of just, I always tell people, like friends, I say, you never know what's coming your way. You don't know. I just kind of ended up here, right? Like, how did I end up here? It's a lot of opportunities and coincidences, luck, and kind of following, I guess, my heart, And so that's what's led me here.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I'm just sitting here listening, thinking, okay, November, you do this training. January, you show up at NARM. And then in March, everything starts shutting down. And the mental health situation in the world, not even just in our country, but in the world, really shifts. And so you're doing a deep dive right during this time into all of this content. Okay, so now the most juicy question, or so far, at least for me, is I want to hear how you use NARM in your work with this integration. And I have some ideas about how you might do that, but I want to hear how this all came together for you.
So it's really interesting. The pre-session is basically NARM with, hey, you could experience these other things. You might see things, you might not see things, you might not have this heavy impact. It may be that you take your ketamine and nothing happens, right? What safety measures do we have in place? If the prescriber's okay doing at home, which is now being talked about whether we should do it or not. So that's a whole nother story. But the people who, my clients who've done it at home have been with their prescribers for a long period of time, don't have a history of substance abuse, sign a consent form to keep the medicines away from children and animals, et cetera, et cetera. So the conversation is, what do you do if you feel overwhelmed? You have to have somebody at home? Those kind of safety pieces. And then, one thing is set and setting. So that's another piece. So that's not necessarily NARM, but it's NARM informed, of course. Like, what is your set and setting? You need to be in a place where you're not going to be interrupted. We're supposed to do eye shades, which I don't force on anybody, but I'm like, it could be helpful if you feel comfortable putting on eye shades.
Can you talk about that, what that is?
Yeah, so like an eye mask, like when you go to sleep, like you'd see back in the day where people would put them on and go to sleep in the 50s or whatever. I mean, then people use them now with if it's too bright. So it's a soft eye mask, and there's some that kind of cushion around your orbital sockets, so it's not like right flat against, and I like those. And it's so that you can honor the going within.
Okay.
Because often people are going within, right? Especially with like ketamine, we talk about is kind of like a skeleton key because it's an anesthetic, but it can take on more psychedelic entheogen properties where you go within to the extreme of what they call, that people may have heard, the K-hole, where you're fully dissociated, which usually doesn't happen with lower doses, but it can happen. Or you can take on more of the like relational feeling a little bit. So ketamine's a really interesting drug in that way. But we do urge people if they're willing. And consent, that's the difference. When I was trained with psilocybin, one of the things that they have in their model, the way that they do things kind of is to tell people you need to go within when they start to come out. And it's like, no. There's a discussion of like, look, part of this medicine, from my perspective, when I'm doing this NARM informed and using NARM. So, hey, this is a possibility and you may want to come out of it. That's okay. But one of the reasons that we're doing this medicine is to go within. Would it be okay if I asked you, could you go within?
Okay, I can really appreciate that. Yeah, so there's still really consent there, but you're kind of just reminding them, this is one of the reasons that we're doing this. What would it be like if?
Yes, what would it be like if? Exactly. And so then it's also like, what is it that you want for yourself? What are you looking for in this experience? And really drilling down, right, to find what is an intention, but to me is a NARM state, right? Well, I'm looking for presence, peace, trust, whatever, And sometimes it's more complex than that. And just like with NARM, when people are struggling to find what it is they want, you can honor a version of it. The other thing I do, which I need to take better photos for this, but I can't find them right now, but I have all sorts of oracle cards. I can't find my roomy ones. Oh, here they are. So one of the things that I offer is that if you want, I can draw a card. I shuffle them. This is my roomy oracle deck. And I can draw a card for you, and I can send you a picture since I won't be there. Or if we were in person, then you can rummage through my deck. I've got that. I've got a Woodland Wardens. I've got some Starseed and Empath's Oracle. And it's not that you have to do it. It's, would you like this? And so then you can read it and say,
yeah,
figure out what the intention is. This one's the Angel Rasbar. Tell me the truth, I asked love. What are you? I am the everlasting life, love said. I am the recurring joy of living. And then it gives the great beloved sees what is in your heart, what it is you wish to offer, and is saying yes. Will you choose to put aside your doubts and believe in yourself? Will you believe in the power of divine love that reaches out to the world through your willing soul? Ah, yes. I knew your tremendous heart wanted to serve more than it wanted to fear. So that's just one of them. I mean, they're all different, right? They're Rumi sayings.
Yeah, to me, that sounds like the invitation to go within in a beautiful kind of poetic way. Can you talk really quickly about like the origins of the oracle cards? Because I think a lot of folks at least I didn't for a long time really understand, like there's a foundation in psychology here.
Oh, well, so I don't actually know the full.
Oh, okay. Well, you still probably know more than me, but what I've come to understand is that there's really deep roots, not just in spirituality and all of that, but like there's some really sound, psychological, roots. So anyway, I love that you integrate that in.
I know there's some Jungian concepts that are in there, and that what we understand of a lot of this work, though, is rooted in psychology. It's ancient philosophy.
Right. Exactly.
So that's how I understand it, right? If you go back and look at Buddhism, there's a lot of psychological concepts. That's why we're utilizing it. And that's true of, I was raised Hindu, and that's true of Hinduism too. And so you've got these roots, and you've got that in a lot of the mysticism. So there is a lot of psychology to all of it. And that's what I know. Like, I don't know much more than that.
That's all I was pointing to. It's relevant on so many levels. And I don't think I understood that for a really long time.
Oh, yeah. So that's funny because I was like, well, what? No. Okay.
Like maybe that's just obvious to you, but for a lot of us, that wasn't obvious for a long time.
Well, and I guess, so here's the other thing that may have drew me partially to this work is I have a background in religion. I was a religion minor, almost a major in undergrad, kind of did everything. When I say I love to learn, I do really love to learn. So I was almost a major, but my wonderful professors said, yeah, don't do that. You're going to have to find a professorship or go to seminary. And there's not just that many opportunities. But it really informed the psychological for me. Understanding systems, understanding people, understanding one of the areas that I loved was the problem of evil and suffering. So I think that for me, you're right, there's a certain bent towards understanding the spiritual as part of our psychology because you can't take it apart. So when I think about these cards, there's some of my clients who are like, no. But then some people who are really, they're like, you know what, that would help me find my intention. Yeah, or that might marry with my intention that I've already set. So we're setting those intentions for them in the sense that they're finding what they want for themselves. So sometimes clients who've done this many times, they're like, okay, I've got my intention already. It's like, okay, what is it that you want for yourself on this journey? And they say, I just want to be open to anything that I experience. So that's not a state necessarily, right? But it is in its own way.
Yeah.
And so we go with that. Okay. And then what would that be like for you? Just to kind of drill it down, give them some awareness around that. And they're able to bring that in, and we discuss, okay, write it down, go over your intention before the session. There's some flight instructions that the Polaris Insight Center has been willing to share. They share all their documents. They're wonderful about that, which I think is how it should be. We should all share our materials, right?
Yeah.
Because this is about collaboration, connection, and community. And so there's some flight instructions of allowing yourself to be present, go in. And so the client can read it to themselves, but ideally I ask them to have somebody there to read it. And so then set and setting is what music should not have words so it doesn't influence. There's a lot of playlists out there. And so people pick whatever they want to pick. And music does influence. People could do it with quiet if they want to, but then they're hearing other sounds, So we do ask, if they're willing to put on headphones and listen to music. And I've not had anybody say, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. They're like, okay. And sometimes it's like, that playlist didn't work. I'm like, okay, well, let's mark that down. And then sometimes it's like, that was great. And so most people want to put on the eye shades so that they can have the experience. So with NARM, that's a long version of the pre-session. That's a lot of different pieces. And then integration is really, what was that like for you? That's the start. And then what came up for you? We had talked about this is what you want for yourself. What was the experience like? Is this, as we're going through what the experience was, and sometimes it's a little not NARMy because sometimes there is a little bit of interpretation, but there's a lot of reflection of like, what do you think? How does that relate to what you wanted for yourself? And sometimes it's something completely different. Like if somebody's lost a loved one, that person showed up and, just was there for a brief moment. Okay, what was that experience like? So you're still honoring the intention of NARM, even if you're not utilizing exactly the same techniques. It's so NARM informed. And so then it's like, okay, so this was the intention that you set. Do you feel like that's what your experience? What was that like for you? What else? Do you feel like the intention has changed? Like, is there something else you want for yourself? Where are you now? Really checking in to see where the experience is. And before that, also informing people that they might be tired, not to do anything drastic. Oh, the other thing that's really important is like, don't have serious conversations within 24 or 48 hours of doing your session. People have had arguments with their partners, and it's really gotten in the way of kind of that experience because it's like it marinates for a few days in there. So yeah, the integration is really letting people share their experience and then offering concepts around that, around consent, agency, and seeing you really are kind of tracking a child consciousness, adult consciousness without being explicit about it. Because if they're able to really accept whatever came up, that's not child consciousness.
Yeah.
That, of course, doesn't need to be said, but that's really what we're seeing. And then, what expands contracts. So that idea of just that people will kind of shrink back. And so being able to hold and again, educate, there's a lot of psychoeducation. Hey, you may have some different experiences over the next few days. Other things may come up. And Polaris talks about making sure you're available for people. And of course, I don't necessarily schedule another session unless somebody needs it, but they know that if something really serious comes up, they can get a hold of me. Not as a crisis, but as let's get a session in within a couple of days or a day or so. That hasn't happened, but it's available because you just don't know how this is going to process for people. We don't know how this impacts people fully. Everybody's a unique human with unique experiences. So being the support without overdoing it, that's where the countertransference is. It's like, again, for you, what are your limits? What are you okay with your clients contacting you? How are you okay with them contacting you? How do you want to check in with them? Those pieces.
I'm hearing this piece. I don't know how to quite talk about it, but like that you're offering space for them afterward, this integration piece, if something comes up, they feel held. And I know as a client, how often I felt like I need to get into a session, and even just making the appointment, even if it's like 2 weeks out, I already am feeling better. I'm already feeling that support. So I imagine that's kind of, maybe like you're saying, it's not like on a crisis basis, but like if you contact me within a few days, I'm going to be available to like schedule something. And how that feels as a client, how held, we feel when that's kind of the container.
Well, healing happens in connection,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just that relationship. I'm hearing that sounds so important. Oh my gosh, thank you for sharing all of that. Like I know that there's so many pieces and layers to that, and you're probably just, giving us a basic outline of like what it's like for you. But I really, really appreciate you kind of sharing how you, weave in NARM and how it's really so foundational to the work that you're doing. I wondered if you had any specific like stories or, experiences that you could share with us, in terms of like working with clients in this, way with their complex trauma.
Yeah, I think I can. So I've had a few clients, and so I'm going to just kind of meld them together to keep,
Yep. Yep.
confidentiality here.
For sure.
But I've had some just kind of just sit back and not really have a deep experience, and then I've had others who have tried to create an experience, and so then we talked about maybe this medicine's not right for you, which is a great conversation to have. Like, hey, if you're not experiencing what the intention was, or if this experience really isn't giving you anything, then is it right for you? Yeah, maybe not. Okay. Do you want to stop for a little while and see how you feel? Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Okay. The other ones, it's like I said, there was one client who'd lost a loved one who showed up, and then there was like pieces of like animal faces, and some of it kind of disturbing, almost for you and me on the outside, but wasn't for the client. The animal didn't have eyes, was looking at them. But the client was able to tell me, I was like, okay, so what was that like for you? So I didn't say, oh, that must have been scary. No, 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 because that's not very NARM informed. And it's also taking away, right? Like I'm taking something away from you. What was that like? Well, it wasn't really, it was a little weird, but it wasn't really scary. It's like it was important. And so then I was like, what does that mean for you? He walked me through what was important, and the details of that. And there's like another one that was like, they turned into dirt, but were reborn. I mean, just all these different images that pop up for people that are then like, okay, what do you think that means for you? Well, I know my brother or sister, or whoever showed up, and I was sad, but it didn't feel as bad, right? I'm very cautious for people doing this with immediate grief, especially if there's traumatic grief, because I do think the shock trauma needs to be dealt with before you go into this, because that could just not, I don't think that can end well when your body's still in shock.
Yeah, it sounds too destabilizing.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
But when they feel, and these are clients I've worked with for a long time, most of them, when they feel more grounded and rooted, they can often, within a month or two, go into that experience. It just really depends on the how traumatic the grief was and how they're relating to it, of course. Other people have told me they've seen like, I don't know, kind of like some people are going to remember Q*bert. There were squares. There was this little guy with one eye, a little cute little monster who was a Q shape really, and would jump on these tiles. And like one client said they saw Q*bert, like the game, but not without the Q*bert character, and like it disintegrating in front of them, but coming back together as something else. And so again, it was like, what was that like for you? How does that relate to this intention? And then sometimes they say, there was something there, but I don't know. I don't know what it was. I can't describe it to you. Okay, what was that experience like? How did you feel? Or what did you think, right? Depending on where that client is and what the intention was. A lot of people, though, who I end up working with are able to embody by the time they have this experience. We make sure that, because I did get one client from a prescriber who'd done an IM who had basically an ego death and was a little freaked out. A lot of prescribers keep, some rescue meds on hand, injection-wise, for this reason, and they can give it if they need to, and that's up to them. And so really with that one, we talked about what they experienced, and I did a NARM session in the sense of like, okay, so what is it that you want for yourself, given that this happened? That's all I did for integration was a NARM session. After this really not great experience, we did a NARM session, and it was very anchoring, so I started working with this client. And then after that, it seemed like the ketamine sessions went okay. So sometimes I really feel that NARM can help even make sense of things that don't feel so good in these sessions. Because my understanding is the client was saying, I feel like I'm dying because it was the ego death, which can feel very scary for people, which could be disidentification, right, in NARM. And so that can also happen. And that's also a piece of how do we handle that in the moment? How do you handle that after? And I think after it's very clear that as long as the person can be present with you, you can do a NARM session.
Cool. I love that. I love this piece that you're saying, even when things don't even when it's not how did you say it? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but even when it wasn't necessarily a comfortable experience with the psychedelic, that processing it with a NARM session, it's like grist for the mill kind of.
Yeah, it is, because what was that about? Yeah. So I know there are other modalities that people use, but I can't imagine doing this work without NARM. I just think that with NARM being so honoring and with people coming in with vulnerability, it's just, to me, I'm going to say it, the perfect match.
That's exciting. It's exciting that, that you're doing this work, that this is happening. I have one more question. I'm wondering, all of this, because you're sharing so much, there's so much richness to this conversation. And again, I know there's like so many rabbit holes we could go down if we had the time. But I'm wondering, what have you learned in your process? And it could be personal or professional, but like in your process with complex trauma that's really helped you, that you would like our listeners to know, that you want others to know about?
I have never, ever actually thought about that because I think I'm just operating in what we talked about at the beginning, the ethics. So I think holding, and this is why I've never thought about it, because my mission, my heart is in holding the sacredness of this human and of myself. So that means showing up fully, and staying in the 50-50, of course, in myself and meeting the other person. So I'm not fully putting myself in too much.
Completely in there.
No,
Yeah.
but, and I've often said it's almost like 100-100 in psychedelics is what it can feel like to me. It's like, because it just feels different. As a clinician, if you're ever present for a session, it just feels very different. You feel energetically. I don't know what mirror neurons are going off. I don't know what's happening for us, but something is happening. So for me, really honoring consent and agency, because as you were talking about, a lot of these people have experienced their ability to consent taken away. Some of them don't even operate in the world with agency. I don't have a choice. I don't,
Yeah.
Or have operated that way. And then really honoring this person who's, Brad often talks about with our clients, why'd you show up for therapy? Because that's hard. They're showing up for this. Whoa. And so that's a piece that I'm constantly holding. And this person desperately wants to get better. Desperately wants things to change in their life. They're willing to do this, even if it's scary, to make these changes, to connect themselves to others, to make life more meaningful for them. And so I think those are the pieces of complex trauma that I'm holding. It's like understanding how this person is showing up myself, having the ethics, the vulnerability, the courage, the consent. I cannot talk about consent enough, because you can't tell people to just go within. No, you need to go within. Excuse me? I can't talk about consent enough. So that was a big piece. So that's what I've learned the most, is honoring those things and just holding the framework of what is this experience like for them.
Thank you so much for sharing. I know we just dipped our toe in the water. I hope we can connect and like have more conversations around this, because I'm fascinated and it just feels really, really important. And so thank you for sharing what you have with us today. And I'm so excited again about the webinar that's coming out. If folks go to narmtraining.com, they can get all the details on the webinar that's coming up here with Monti Paul on healing complex trauma with psychedelics and plant medicine. We're so happy to have you. We're excited to have you on the webinar. Where can listeners find you? Where can they connect with your work and more with what you're doing?
So I do have a business Instagram account. I think it's under @mindfulmonti. And then I have a Facebook page. If you Google mindfulness with Monti, that's the name I came up with a long time ago when I first embarked on this journey of having a private practice. And because I think mindfulness is at the heart of NARM, actually. It takes mindfulness to the next level. So if you Google that, Facebook, Instagram, my website, those are all places you can connect with me. I do post some funny stuff occasionally on Instagram too. So, I like some hilarious things. So
awesome. And we'll put those links in the show notes so folks can track you down and follow your work and all that good stuff. Well, thank you again. And I'm excited to connect with you again on the webinar and hope more folks join us for that. And appreciate you taking the time.
Yes, I'm very excited about that. Thank you for letting me be here and share about this. I really absolutely appreciate that and appreciate you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma.
Are you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma? If so, we invite you to consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model in support of trauma-informed care. We are excited to offer psychoeducational and clinical trainings for a variety of mental health professionals. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule.
Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.